Chapter 5: Evolution and Biodiversity: Origins, Niches, and Adaptation. Our planet is in what is considered the Goldilocks zone. It's not too cold, not too hot, not too big, and not too small. As a result, Earth slowly evolved into a planet that could eventually sustain life. There were two steps to this evolutionary process, both chemical and biological. The chemical phase of Earth's evolution consisted of the formation of essential molecules for life, such as polymers and organic molecules. In the biological phase of Earth's evolution, these molecules formed the first life, prokaryotic organisms. This eventually gave way to single-celled eukaryotes and eventually multicellular eukaryotic organisms. We have evidence for these organisms trapped in fossils and ice core samples. These organisms changed over time to create the organisms we are surrounded by today by a process called evolution. In evolution, we learn that all organisms we see on Earth have descended from a common ancestor. Remember, evolution cannot occur at the individual level. Unless a change that occurs in an individual organism is at the genetic level, then it will not be passed down to the next generation and thus will not generate a drastic change in the species. Non-genetic changes that an organism undergoes in its life are not considered to be evolution. Evolution is simply the generation of genetic variability in the gene pool of a population. Genetic variability arises from genetic mutations. Mutations can occur in two fashions: through damage from the environment by UV radiation or chemical mutagens, or through replication mishaps. Mutations are not based on traits that an organism needs to acquire to be successful. Mutations are spontaneous, thus the effects of evolution are spontaneous as well. Not all mutations are beneficial. The organisms we see today are successors in the game of evolution. They spontaneously develop the traits necessary for their success. Had they not, they would not have passed down their traits to the following generations, and therefore we do not see their respective genes represented in the gene pool after their death. How does an organism evolve? Not without some kind of pressure. If an organism is already extremely fit for the environment in which it lives, there is no pressure to change. Organisms are placed under this pressure by the environment in which they live. There are certain abiotic and biotic factors that an environment possesses that place pressure on organisms. If this environmental pressure causes a change in the frequency of alleles in the gene pool of a population, then the population is said to have undergone natural selection. Natural selection can only occur under the following conditions. The gene in question must be naturally variable. If the gene has very little variability, then the environment cannot select for individuals that best fit the environment. Next, the trait must be heritable. This means that it has to be a trait that is genetically based, otherwise the trait won't be passed down. This is an occurrence that requires multiple generations. Last, the influx of said trait must lead to differential reproduction. This means that the trait leads to a higher rate of reproduction in organisms that possess it. Over many generations, we would expect to see an influx in the successful gene as the organisms with the gene reproduce at a higher rate than those without it. If a trait obtained by a genetic mutation is specifically selected for by the environment, then it is said to have undergone microevolution. There are three types of natural selection: stabilizing, directional, and diversifying or disruptive. All three types deal with traits that already exist in the gene pool. Already exist. We are not talking about genetic mutations here. It can be a trait as simple as varying lengths of tails in tigers. In stabilizing selection, we see an influx in the number of individuals that display the traits in the middle of the normal spectrum for said trait. With our tigers, this would be a medium tail length. In directional selection, we see an influx in the number of individuals that display traits on either extreme of the normal spectrum for said trait. With our tigers, this would either be short tails or long tails, but not both at the same time. Last, we have disruptive or diversifying selection. Here, we see an influx in the number of individuals that display traits on both ends of the normal spectrum for said trait. With our tigers, we would see more tigers with short tails or long tails, but fewer tigers with medium-length tails. This can create new species, hence the name diversifying. The creation of a new species is called speciation. Organisms can evolve together in a mutualistic relationship. This is called coevolution. Our best example is the pollination of flowers by pollinators. Over time, pollinators have evolved the traits necessary to obtain food from flowers, and flowers have evolved structures that force the pollinator to spread pollen from flower to flower while obtaining this food source. If an organism is fit for its environment, then it will take on a role in the ecosystem. This role is called an organism's ecological niche. The full potential role an organism can play in its environment is called the fundamental niche. This includes its role in the biogeochemical cycles, food webs, and any necessary abiotic factors the organism needs to survive. This is not realistic in nature because competition is a natural thing. Species are almost always in competition with other species for the resources they need in their environment. This competition splits niches apart, and organisms find what is called their realized niche. This is the portion of the fundamental niche of an organism that the organism actually fills. When discussing ecological niches, we can categorize species into two major groups: generalist and specialist. Generalist species can fill a broad range of niches. This makes them very versatile and allows them to live in a variety of environments. Specialist species can only fill select niches. They are not versatile and can be very sensitive to minor changes in their environment. This makes them more likely to be endangered than generalist species. Back to speciation. There are two major mechanisms that can lead to the formation of new species. The first of which is geographic isolation. This occurs when organisms of the same species are separated by a physical barrier that prevents reproduction. This cutoff prevents any new mutations from being intermixed into the overall population. If the physical barrier lasts long enough, then the two groups can become genetically different enough that they will not be able to successfully mate. At this point, the organisms are officially in reproductive isolation. That's chapter 5.